Hello colleagues, my name is Konstantinos Kiritopoulos. I'm an Associate Professor of Project and Risk Management at the National Technical University of Athens, and today I will be talking to you about the basic processes and relevant terms that we use in order to manage project risks. But first of all, let's talk about what is a risk. So the risk, according to all the known definitions, is something related to uncertainty. According to the Project Management Institute, a risk is an uncertain event. An event that, if it occurs, will have an effect, positive or negative, to one or more of the project objectives. So the key here is the word uncertainty. You cannot have a risk if you don't have an uncertainty, so something uncertain. And the other thing is the effect on objectives, which practically means that before you are able to perform risk management, you need to make sure that you have identified the project objectives. If you have not identified the project objectives, then you are not really sure whether something, an uncertain event, is really a risk or not. Because it's not all the uncertain events that are risks. It's only these uncertain events that have an impact on your objectives. This is all about what we call an individual risk. But individual risk is not the only thing. Another thing that you have is the variability. I will give you an example. If you perform an activity, say you are programming a particular feature in your program, then the duration of this coding process is not absolutely specific. That means it's not absolutely, let's say, for example, 10 hours. It's going to be in between 8 to 12 hours or 9 to 11 hours or something like that. So this is a variability that brings uncertainty. It does affect project objectives if we assume that one of your project objectives is to finish in time. So you need to take into account this variability as well. If you combine all the individual risks as well as the variabilities in your project, then you will come up with what we call overall risk. And you might be able to assume that, and this is the case, that when you're talking about individual risks, usually when it comes to analysis, you perform qualitative analysis. But when it comes to overall project risk, then you usually perform quantitative analysis. Keep this in mind, and I will come to this. I will come back to this a little bit later. So, plenty of times people are confused between a risk and an issue. They look alike, especially when we're comparing threats to issues, because usually issues are related to problems. Some people believe that problems are just negative issues, so they believe that there are positive issues as well. But most of the times when we're talking about an issue, we're talking about a problem. And the basic differentiation here is that the issue is you have the hot potato at hand. You need to do something now, not in the future. So the difference is that an issue is something certain, something that has happened already, while on the other hand, a risk is something that might happen in the future. It includes the element of uncertainty that differentiates it from a risk, from an issue. Examples of risks might be a potential vendor's delay. But if your vendor is already delayed, then that's not a risk anymore. That's an issue. It has happened. It is there. If a change request has arrived, that's not a risk. It has arrived. There is no uncertainty. So it's an issue. If a team member left the project, then you have something to work on now. There is no uncertainty here. So this is the basic difference between a risk and an issue. Now, the question that one would ask is, why bother doing risk management? And there are some good reasons for doing that. One of the reasons is that risk management is a very good line of defense. Imagine that your project doesn't go very well, but on the other hand, you have already identified and discussed in the team and you have escalated all your concerns with all the risks that are present. So you have done your best, you have identified it, you analyzed it, you did your best in responding to these risks, but still the project didn't go very well. Well, what you can really say is that, listen, I did identify what the risks were. We decided to go on. I assume that we had good reasons to do that, but then it didn't work out. So with risk management, you can prove practically your due diligence about project management. And of course, the basic reason is not that. The basic reason is not to defend yourself. The basic reason is the fact that it works. Because most of the times, what's going to happen if you do perform risk management is either the project will succeed, which is the best case, and this is what you want. It means that it will deliver the product or service that you are doing with the project within the constraints by achieving the objectives of the project. Or even if it fails, it's going to be what we call a safe failure. So in other words, it's going to fail, but not as much as it would if there was absence of risks, of risk management, I mean. The bottom line is that if you do perform risk management, you just sleep better at night. Now, this is the overall process. No matter which standard you look at, even if you look at the ISO 31000, or if you look at the PMBOK and the relevant standard for managing project risk in portfolios, programs, and standards, and projects of PMI, you will find that there are 4 basic stages in risk management. The first one is the identification. Second one is analysis and evaluation. These 2 stages, or 3, some would say, plenty of times they're called assessment of risks. So assessment would be identification, analysis, and evaluation. And then you have response and monitoring. Let's go very quickly to see what each one of those stages involves. So obviously the identification is all about identifying what might go wrong, or do not forget that what might go better than planned. So it's not only about threats, but it's also about opportunities as well. And this is not the point to worry about whether a risk is high risk or a low risk. That's not your concern when you're doing identification. During the identification stage, you want to gather as many risks as possible. Identification, in my opinion, is probably the most important stage. And why is this? This is because if you have not identified the risk, then you really don't know what is happening. You don't know what to analyze, you don't know what to respond to, and so on. So this is where we start. As soon as you have identified the risks, then you need to make sure that you analyze and evaluate them. So the analysis part, this can be, as you can see in the slide, divided into qualitative analysis and quantitative analysis. It will give you an order of magnitude of the risk. You need to be very, very careful when choosing between qualitative and quantitative analysis. The qualitative is non-negotiable. So especially when you're talking about individual risks, all the individual risks should be qualitatively analyzed. But in order to go to the next step, which is the quantitative analysis, either it is at the risk level, at the individual risk level, or at the overall project risk level, you need to make sure that you have good quality data. Because if you don't, then you get to have what we usually call garbage in, garbage out. You need to be very, very careful in making sure that you can trust your data, because there is a very well-known bias, which is which is hanging into the results of a software and believing that what you get there is the absolute truth. But the problem is that the software will always give you a result. No matter what you put in, you will get a result. And the quality of this result is straight proportional to the quality of the inputs that you put in. So if you don't feel that you have the appropriate data, just make sure that you don't bother with quantitative analysis. And then we come to evaluation. Evaluation is comparing the results, or comparing the risk level, the risk score, as we will see it in a few moments, with a specific threshold. If you are above a specific threshold, then what you need to do is respond to the risk. And risk response, you have specific strategies in order to have a proper response, and you need to pick the one that fits better into the specific risk every time. And you will see that lately the Project Management Institute, when they drafted the PMBOK, the new PMBOK, and specifically the chapter about risk, they divided the response process, the response stage, into two sub-processes. The first one is planning response, and the second one is implementing response. And obviously, it is not that all these years that we didn't have this differentiation, we did not implement responses. Of course, we did. But the point here is to stress that sometimes we take decisions about responses, but we do not really reach the implementation stage. And this is very, very important. For as long as you have not done the response, the risk is still there, and it has exactly the same level as before you identified the appropriate responses. The last process in the risk management overall process, the last sub-process, is monitoring. You have many good reasons to monitor your risks, mainly because it's a dynamic phenomenon and risks change with time. New risks come in. You need to make sure that your actions, the response actions, are implemented, and so forth. So this cycle is a cycle that will start at the start of the project and will finish only at the end of the project. And you're going round and round and round and round. You identify, analyze, evaluate, respond, and then monitor and control. Monitor and control is practically restarting the circle. You need to make sure that you will have a risk report at every project report that you are doing. That's a very important point. Now, the main thing in the identification is that you gather as many as you can, as we said. And the other thing is to make sure that the process is all-inclusive. So you need to make sure that you will ask all the stakeholders, or the kind of stakeholders that you have in your project, because plenty of times it's not only the project team or the project manager that can tell you about the risks. The project manager might be an experienced person, so they can really have a very good idea of what might happen in the project, but some other stakeholders, no matter what is the rank in the organizational chart, if you're talking about an internal project, or if they come from the client, or the contractor, if it's such a project, they might have a very good idea of risks that you have not really thought about and you have not identified. So this is a very good example of how an unknown, as we call risks that we are not aware about, might become a known unknown, which are risks that we do have awareness about them. So maybe there is a risk out there that you have not identified, but one of your stakeholders might know it. So if you talk to them, they might bring it up, and then it becomes a known unknown for you as well. And of course, do not forget the opportunities. Now, how does one perform the risk identification process? The easiest thing is to ask the expert. So brainstorming, groups of experts, the team, some stakeholders gather together and they figure out which the risks might be. But there is another process which is even better, but it requires maturity in managing risk, which is the organization memory. So in a nutshell, this means that you can capture the lessons learned from every single project that you are doing and create a database that includes all this information, which practically means that you do know the risks that you have faced in the past. And when you're doing a similar project, then you can take a sneak peek into the previous projects and bring up all these risks, all these practically issues that you faced as risks, potential events that might happen in this new project that you have now. One important thing here is not only to capture the issues, capture the risks in your database, but on the other hand, finding a very efficient process in order to give this information to the stakeholders that need it, so the project manager mainly and the project teams that start a new project. That is really something that one needs to be very careful about. And you have some other tools as well. The most well-known tool, I would say, is the risk breakdown structure. What is a risk breakdown structure? A risk breakdown structure is a hierarchical analysis, a hierarchical decomposition of the overall project risk in specific areas. So you see here in this example that you have law, you have finance, you have technical risks, you have managerial risks, and some of those might have subcategories as well, like planning, requirements, testing. And by seeing each category, you have to face this as a source of risks. So what risks can we have under requirements? Let's say that we are building a software with some features that we have not done before. So this is a source of uncertainty. And then we can go even further and describe in more detail what might go wrong, what we think that might go wrong in relation to requirements, and then create a list of relevant risks. So you don't have one risk breakdown structure for every single project. There are plenty of risk breakdown structures. If you see, for instance, the academic literature, or even if you just Google it, you will come up with interesting risk breakdown structures, usually related to specific industries. So if you're searching IT or ICT, you will find a bunch of risk breakdown structures. If you see construction, you will have some different risks. This one, the one that you see in front of you, is a very generic risk breakdown structure that probably could fit any industry that has a technical component. So this is mainly about sources, but you can go one step, dig one step more into the core of the risks, and go under each one of these categories and start thinking about specific risks. So if you go under law, that's just an example, you might have claims or you might have changes in legislation. Please do remember that no matter how good your risk catalog or risk breakdown structure is, when it comes to your specific project, the risks are going to be very, very specific to the project. You should not stop at something generic, because this will only give you the opportunity to take generic actions in order to respond. But if you go very straight and specifically talk about your project, so it's not changes in legislation generically, it is a very specific change that I have identified that the government, for instance, is talking about a new law which might affect the project. This is much easier to be controlled, and not control in a way that we're going to change what the government is going to say. This is a typical external risk, so we cannot do something about it. But we know what to monitor, Instead of monitoring the legislation as a whole, we might want to focus our attention on monitoring a very specific part of the legislation that is changing and affects our project. So just make sure that even if you have a risk catalog, even if you have the memory from your organization, so you're talking about risks that are quite specific to the kind of projects that you're doing, remember that your specific project at this very moment is unique, and this means that it's going to have unique risks as well. Now, the analysis, as soon as you have the bunch of risks that might affect your project, if they occur, you can do qualitative or quantitative analysis. We said a few things about it. I want to stress two more points. Be objective. Everyone brings their biases in the project, so their beliefs and their attitudes. You need to be as much objective as you can and make sure that you assess your data. The quality of your data is going to dictate the quality of the results that you will have. When we're talking about qualitative analysis, usually the risk matrix comes to mind. So I assume that you have all seen a risk matrix, which is, probability on the y-axis, impact on the x-axis, and the combination will give you what we call exposure to risk or risk score. And this will dictate the level that you have, whether risk is in the end high, medium, or low. Before we try to dig into this matrix even more, we need to talk about three very important terms in risk management. And this is risk attitude, risk appetite, and risk threshold. So what's risk attitude? Risk attitude is how each individual feels about the risk. And there is a very big spectrum that ranges from what we call a risk-averse person to a risk seeker. A risk-averse is someone who is not feeling really comfortable with risks, while on the other hand, the risk seeker is someone who is very, very comfortable with risk. So a gambler is obviously a risk seeker. But this is a personal attitude. When it comes to a project or when it comes to an organization, the organization or the project board should define the risk appetite. And what is risk appetite? In a few words, risk appetite is how much risk we're willing to undertake in order to fulfill the project objectives. And in order for this to be practically applicable, we need to make sure that we define some thresholds. So with the risk appetite, you define a general strategy that you verbally describe or in written, but in words you describe how much risk you want to undertake. But on the other hand, when it comes to practice, you need to have some thresholds. And you see that these thresholds that depict in kind of numerical terms the risk appetite of the organization or the project board is depicted with the lines that differentiate between green and yellow, yellow and red, and so on. And obviously, the more risk averse you are, the more red you see on the table, the more risk seeker you are, the more let's say better, the more risk you're willing to undertake. So the risk appetite is towards undertaking more risk in order to fulfill our project objectives. The more red you see, and on the contrary, the less risks that you're willing to undertake, the more green you see on this risk matrix. So qualitative analysis for individual risks usually will give you an idea of where your risk stands. Is it a tolerable risk? Is it a non-wanted risk or non-tolerable risk? That's the point. Another basic thing that I see it wrongly applied plenty of times is to make sure that your scales correspond to something. So if you just have, low, medium, high, even if this is for the probability, or even if this is for the impact. You are just you're just doing a tick box exercise without really making sure that the whole project team is on the same page. And why is this? Because something that for me, a probability that for me, a likelihood that for me might be very low, for someone else might be medium. We don't have the same opinion about these things because we are not at the same spectrum of risk attitude. That's the main differentiation factor. So what you need to do is make sure that at the project level, these scales are defined. And obviously, as you can see here, you can, this is an option, but you can reach a point, say this is 80%, that you can say, you know what, the probability here is so high that I decide to manage this risk as if it was an issue. The same is for the impact. When you're talking about impact, just make sure that you take into account all the basic objectives of your project. So if one of your objectives is to finish in time, just make sure that you have an impact scale which explains the scale level for time. If another goal you have is to keep the project in budget, then make sure that you have a relevant impact scale for cost and so on. And as soon as you have done the whole thing of analysis, then you do evaluate the risk, which means see if the risk is green, so you're okay, or if it's yellow, and if it's red, it's even worse. Worse if the risks are threats, because do not forget, I will keep telling you that you have two sides of risks. So if you have a red opportunity, probably you are very happy. If you have a red threat, then probably you're very sad. You need to make sure that you monitor both these kind of risks. But as soon as some risks are over a specific threshold, then you need to respond to them. And you need to consider the available strategies, and then consider the available options, the possible actions within these strategies. Pick the ones that will give you the they will be the most effective and efficient. Make sure that you do realize that each action comes with a cost, or most of the actions come with a cost. Make sure that it's doable, and the most important of all, make sure that if you plan a response, this response is going to be implemented as well. So what about strategies? What are the main strategies? You see that for each strategy related to a threat, there is a mirror strategy related to the opportunity. If I very quickly tell you what is the main strategies here. You have avoidance, and avoidance would practically mean that the risk is not there anymore. So you change a parameter in your project, say the way that you're doing your project is creating the technique that you have picked, even if it's a programming technique or a construction technique or whatever, depending on your project. And this technique brings up a risk, and you change this technique. If you change the technique completely, then all the risks related to the technique are vanished, and this would mean avoidance. So there is no probability that the risk will appear anymore. Transfer, on the other hand, is something that it is most people are very familiar with it, because all we are insured for something. And insurance is a typical strategy. It's typical action under the strategy of transfer risk. This is mainly about the impact, which means that if the risk finally does occur, then the impact will not be suffered by you, but from the insurer. And on the other side, you have sharing the risk, giving something of the positive impact to someone else in order to increase this risk score. The most typical one is mitigation. So we're talking about reducing the risk if we have a threat, or enhancing the risk if we have an opportunity. And we'll talk about this in detail. And of course, acceptance. Make sure that there are two kind of risks that might be accepted. The ones are the green ones, so this is obvious. But there are some not green risks that you might accept as well. Make sure that when you do that, you have a very good reason and you have documented the reasons why you do accept these risks while they are not green. So when we're talking about the mitigation, you have the exposure to risk, of course, which is probability that the risk might happen times the impact if it happens. And then you have these options. You have the option to take some actions that target the causes of the risk, so they reduce the probability, or you can take some actions that reduce the impact if the risk occurs. Again, this is all about threats. You can imagine the mirror side of it for the opportunities. And if you either reduce the probability or the impact for a threat, this is going to change the exposure. If you want to be safer, you can also design some contingency plans, which is plans that you design very well before the risk occurs. So always remember that the risk management is a preventative process. So you're talking about prevention, not correction. And you design the contingency plans before, and you have a trigger event. You say, when I see this, when this trigger event comes, the trigger event might be the risk itself happening, but it might be some events prior to the risk or some signs prior to the risk that will put in action your contingency plan, which is going to happen sometimes before and sometimes after the risk occurs. The last thing that you can do, of course, is to perform a workaround. But when you're performing a workaround, practically you're saying that all my plans were not successful, which is not very good, to be honest. When you are responding to a risk, make sure that secondary risks do not jump out of it. What is a secondary risk? A secondary risk is a risk that comes as a result of a response action to a main risk. And make sure that, of course, the remaining risk, or what we call the residual risk, after the corrective, the response action that you took, plus the new exposure that comes from the secondary risk, are not bigger than the initial risk that you have. So obviously, this would beat the purpose. Now, the last thing, as I said, is monitoring risk. Why do we monitor risks? We do monitor risks because we want to make sure that things are happening. So we have agreed on some actions. Have these actions been implemented? We need to monitor this. As we said before, risk is a dynamic phenomenon. So the fact that you measure the risk at a point in your project doesn't mean that the risk is still at the same level. So the probability that might have changed, the impact might have changed depending on the phase of the project. Some risks have completely vanished because they're not timely anymore. They refer to a previous phase or anything else, so they're not there, and new risks might pop up. So this whole thing is a matter that we focus on when we are monitoring risks. And of course, communication is also a part of this process. Now, how do we do this? There are two main ways of monitoring and reporting risks, and this is the risk sheet, which is the one that you will see in more mature organizations or the ones that are using software in order to do, dedicated software, not just in Excel, for doing risk management. And this is, I will give you some details here. So this is an example of a risk sheet. The first part will focus on the identification, one part of the top one. And we're talking about identification, we're talking about defining the causes, the uncertain event, and the potential impact. You will see that in the description, we follow what we call risk meta language. What's that? This is a way of describing the risk so that to make sure that we have a certain cause. So because the project is highly complex, then we need to give clearly the uncertainty. It may not respond properly to the requirements, definition, activities. So may not, something that might happen, might not happen, depending on the risk. And the last part, it will result in the delay of phase 3, which is the description of the effect on objectives. So because may not, it might, uncertainty, and result in, which means or it will have the effect on, which means that we cover the last part of risk as well. And the next two parts of a risk sheet would be the analysis. So we are practically measuring the risk. You see that this risk started from a high probability and a medium impact, which gave a medium level of risk. And of course, you do have the response actions where you describe what needs to be done and when this is going to be completed. That's also a very important thing, because you can see in this slide that as soon as the actions are completed, then you go back to analysis and you measure the risk again, and you see that this has an impact. So from yellow, this risk after the implementation of the actions, it has become a low level risk. But most of the organizations, what they are doing is that they have a risk register. So the risk register is a snapshot that will give the overall information about all the individual risks in our project. And it's very, very important because you can just look at one specific document. This usually is an Excel spreadsheet, or if you're using a software, it might be a little bit more fancy. That will tell you which are the high risks, which are the medium risks, which are the low risks. So they will guide you on where to put your focus on. All the risks register, or the risk register might have different kind of information depending on the manager, on the project manager, or the kind of project or the type of organization. Some main columns of a risk register would be, of course, the risk itself, the risk owner. Just make sure that you don't confuse the risk owner with the risk action owner. This is two different things. So the risk owner is someone who is really bothered about what this risk might happen. So usually the risk touches upon objectives that he or she are mainly involved with. But the risk action owner is someone who is tasked to carry out a specific action related to the risk. The risk owner might be the same person as the risk action owner. The risk owner might be the same person as the risk action owner, but this might not always be the case. So another column that you have is the ranging of risk. If there are any controls in place, likelihood. We prefer to use the term likelihood when we're talking about qualitative risk analysis. And this is because probability is a very it's a mathematical definition practically. So likelihood probably describes better the notion of what this thing really is. And then you have the impact, and then you have the risk score, and of course the risk evaluation, which is practically telling to people whether this is a non-wanted risk, non-tolerable risks, and so on. The date is very important, which is when you last performed the process, and where this analysis, the risk score, refers to. And of course, you have actions, owners, and completion stage. This is not, this is not written in stone, so you can do different combinations of the attributes of a risk, but this is the main idea of how it works, and it's really very effective. So this was a very quick overview of which are the main processes for risk management and which are the related terms that one should be aware of when they are involved in a risk management team. Make sure that you know the risks that are close to you, the risks that might affect your project. Make sure that you would not rule out the opportunities. You do also have opportunities. Make sure that you do implement the actions that you have planned, and make sure that you involve all the stakeholders in the risks management projects. Risks are there, be aware. I hope this was helpful to you to have an intermediate kind of understanding of what is happening when you are conducting risk management. So all the previous things are based on ISO 31000, which is the standard for ISO regarding risk management, the standard for risk management in portfolios, programs, and projects for PMI, and of course the PMBOK and ISO 21500. I'm always willing to take more risk dialogues. So this is where you can find me, and thank you very much for watching.